They laughed in her face right at the farm gate. A penniless, nameless woman with no one backing her. The manager bluntly said, "What can a woman like you possibly do?" But that night, the child was dying, and no one dared enter that room except her. Evelyn Hart had nothing but her hands and courage, but that was all the baby needed to survive the night. If it were you, would you dare stay? Comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has come. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next, even more dramatic stories. The foreman said it loud enough for everyone to hear. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull Evelyn aside. He just stood there in the pale morning light at the edge of the yard, thumbs hooked in his belt, and looked her up and down the way a man looks at a horse he's already decided not to buy. "We don't need a woman out here," Hank Briggs said, "especially not one like you." Evelyn didn't flinch. She'd heard that sentence, or some version of it, enough times that her body had stopped reacting to it the way it used to. She didn't look away. She didn't straighten her spine to prove something. She just stood there with her travel bag hanging from one hand and the folded letter from the employment notice in the other, and she waited for him to say something that actually meant anything. "I answered the notice," she said. "It said, ranch help needed. Cook, cleaning, general labor. I can do all three." "The notice was a mistake." Briggs crossed his arms. "Mr. Cole's not in any condition to be making decisions right now. You should head back to wherever you came from." "I came from Cheyenne. 3 days on a stage and half a day on foot." She held up the letter. "I'm not heading back anywhere until I speak to Mr. Cole himself." Briggs looked at her the way men like him always looked at women who didn't retreat, like she was a problem he hadn't accounted for and wasn't sure how to get rid of. He glanced back toward the ranch house. It was a big structure, solidly built, but it had the look of a place that had stopped being cared for. The porch railing was cracked. One of the shutters hung at a wrong angle. There was a child's small boot sitting alone in the dirt near the front step, and something about that single boot made Evelyn's chest go tight in a way she couldn't entirely explain. "He's not seen anyone," Briggs said. "Is he sick?" "He's grieving." "How long?" Briggs's jaw moved like he was chewing on something he didn't like the taste of. 7 months. Evelyn looked at the house. She looked at the boot. She looked at the washing line where nothing hung, where there hadn't been laundry hung in what looked like weeks based on the state of the rope, dry and stiff and still. "Is there a child on this property?" she asked. Briggs didn't answer fast enough, and that told her everything. "There's a baby," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's none of your business, miss." "Hart. Evelyn Hart." She tucked the letter into her coat pocket. "And if there's a baby on this property and no woman in this house, then that notice wasn't a mistake, Mr. Briggs. That notice was desperate." She walked past him. He called after her. Something sharp. Something about her not being welcome. About how she had no right to just walk onto a man's property. But Evelyn had already reached the porch step, and when she put her hand on the door and knocked, she heard something that made everything else go quiet. A baby crying. Not the ordinary cry of a child who wanted feeding or holding. This was something else. This was the thin, papery sound of a child who had been crying so long and so hard that the cry had almost worn itself out, down to something barely above silence. A sound so exhausted it barely had shape left to it. Evelyn knocked again, harder. No answer. She tried the door. It opened. The smell hit her first. Wood smoke and something underneath it. Something sour and close. The smell of a sick room that hadn't had its windows opened in too long. She stepped into the front room and let her eyes adjust. The fire had burned low. There were dishes on the table, not many, but unwashed. A pair of men's boots near the door, mud-dried hard on the soles. A coat over a chair. The ordinary debris of a house where someone was surviving but not living. The crying came from down the short hallway. She followed it. The door to the back room was half open. She pushed it gently. The baby was in a wooden crib near the wall. Small. Younger than a year, she thought, though it was hard to say exactly. Red-faced, soaked through its wrappings, crying in that terrible, exhausted way. But it was what she saw when she stepped closer that made her breath catch. The baby was burning up. She could feel the heat from 2 feet away. The child's skin had that awful, dry, papery look that she recognized from the winter her nephew had nearly died of scarlet fever back in Ohio when she was 19. She'd sat with him for 3 nights straight, and she hadn't forgotten what that looked like. The way fever could make a person's skin look somehow thinner, like something was consuming them from the inside. "Hello?" she said softly to the baby, because she didn't know what else to say. She looked around the room. There was a chair near the crib, and in the chair, slumped sideways with his head against the wall, was a man. He was asleep, or something close to it. Big, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and several days of beard, and the look of a man who had not slept properly in longer than just the past night. His hands were in his lap, and even in sleep they were clenched, not loose, like his body didn't know how to let go of whatever it was holding. This was Nathan Cole. She didn't wake him yet. She crossed to the crib first and put her hand flat to the baby's forehead and confirmed what she already knew. High fever. Too high to be comfortable, maybe too high to be safe. She looked around the room for water. There was a pitcher on the small table near the window, half full. She pulled the cloth from her travel bag. She'd packed it out of habit, a piece of soft cotton she used for general purpose, and she wet it in the water from the pitcher and laid it gently against the baby's forehead. The baby's crying shifted. Still crying, still frightened and exhausted and sick, but something in the pitch changed just slightly, like even that small bit of cool cloth registered somewhere beneath the fever. "I've got you," she said, quietly. Not for any audience, just because it was the thing to say. She heard the chair creak behind her. "Who are you?" It wasn't a question. The voice was rough from sleep and something else underneath sleep, something raw. "How did you get in here?" She turned around slowly. Nathan Cole was on his feet. He wasn't a small man. He filled the doorway between the chair and the crib with the particular kind of presence that came from a man who was used to physical work, used to holding things together with his body when everything else failed. But what struck her wasn't his size. It was his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had not slept enough in months, and knew it and had stopped fighting it. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said. "I answered your employment notice. Your foreman turned me away at the gate, but the door was open and I heard your son crying, so I came in." She paused. "Your son has a fever. It's been going on a while, hasn't it?" Nathan stared at her. "I'm not asking to be hired," she said. "I'm telling you your son needs attention right now. You can throw me out after." He looked at the baby. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like a man who had been braced for one kind of blow and got a different kind, and didn't have the energy to recalibrate. "I've been up with him," he said. "I sat with him all night." "I know, I can see that." She kept her voice level, not soft in the way that people used when they were talking to someone fragile, just level, like she was stating facts and facts were what they both needed right now. "When did the fever start?" "Yesterday morning." "Has he kept anything down? Milk? Water?" "Some." "Any rash?" Nathan crossed the room in 3 steps and stood on the other side of the crib looking at his son. Up close she could see how tired he was. Not just last night tired, months of tired, worn into the skin around his eyes and the set of his mouth. "No rash," he said. "Just the fever." "That's good. That's one thing." She wet the cloth again and laid it back against the baby's forehead. "What's his name?" A pause that lasted a beat too long. "Caleb." "Caleb." She looked at the baby. "Hello, Caleb." Caleb looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes that were glassy from fever, and she could see the moment he registered the cloth, the coolness, some small animal comfort that his body recognized even through the fever. He didn't stop crying immediately, but he slowed down. "You need more water," she said to Nathan. "Clean water, cold as you can get it. And if you have willow bark in the house, I need it. Or failing that, peppermint. Anything that'll bring a fever down." She looked up at him. "Do you have those things?" Nathan was watching her. "Mr. Cole." "We might have willow bark," he said. "In the kitchen. My wife kept—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, just pressed his mouth closed for a moment and then said, "In the kitchen. In the cabinet near the stove. She kept things like that." "Will you get it?" she asked. Not demanding, just asking directly, the way she would have asked anyone. "I'll stay with him." He left the room without another word. She stayed at the crib and kept the cloth on Caleb's forehead and talked to him in the low, even voice she'd used with her nephew all those years ago, not saying anything in particular, just making sound, making presence, letting the baby know there was someone there. Caleb had stopped crying and started making a different sound, something that was almost a whimper, which she thought was better than screaming. Whimpering meant a child was still communicating, still trying to reach someone. She could work with that. When Nathan came back with the willow bark and a clean bowl and a pitcher of water that was actually cold from the well, he stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at the two of them. The stranger crouching at his son's crib, her coat still on, her travel bag still on the floor where she'd dropped it. And something moved across his face that he covered over almost immediately. "Here," he said. "Thank you." She knew what she was doing with the willow bark. Her mother had been the woman people called on in their town when someone got sick and there was no doctor close enough to matter. She'd learned from watching, from being in the room, from being the oldest girl who didn't get sent out when things got serious. She prepared the solution carefully, let it cool enough to be safe, and then spent the next 30 minutes working with Nathan to get Caleb to take small amounts of it, which the baby resisted and then gradually stopped resisting as the fever began, slowly, incrementally, to ease. By mid-morning, the fever had dropped enough that Caleb fell into a proper sleep instead of the shallow, exhausted doze of a sick child. Nathan sat in the chair and watched his son sleep, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the trunk near the window and let the silence hold for a while before either of them said anything. "You didn't have to do that," Nathan said finally. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Caleb. "I know. Most people would have walked away when Briggs told them to. Most people weren't looking at a sick baby when Briggs told them." He was quiet again. Then, "Where are you from?" "Ohio originally. Moved to Cheyenne 2 years ago." She paused. "I've been looking for steady work. I can cook, I can clean, I can manage a household. I know something about livestock. My father had a farm. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I'm doing when I do." "You're straightforward." "I find it saves time." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he hadn't yet. Not measuring her, not the way Briggs had, but with something more like plain attention, trying to figure out what he was actually seeing. "The notice was real," he said. "Briggs was wrong to turn you away. I told him to fill it if someone came who could do the work." He rubbed one hand across his face. "I haven't been—" He stopped again, chose different words. "Things have been hard to manage." "I can see that." "That's not an accusation against you," she said, because she could see his jaw tighten. "It's just a fact. You've been keeping a baby alive alone and running a ranch and you're running on nothing. That's not weakness. That's just one man doing too many things with too few hours." Nathan looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable and then looked back at his son. "Briggs won't like it," he said. "I expect not. The men might be difficult. Men usually are when they haven't decided yet whether to respect someone." She said it without heat. "I can manage difficult." He was quiet for a long time. She could hear the wind picking up outside and the distant sound of one of the horses doing something in the corral, and the quiet, even breathing of a baby who had, at least for the moment, turned a corner. "There's a room at the back of the house," Nathan said. "It's small. Used to be a storeroom. There's a cot in there that needs the mattress aired out." He stood up. He was taller than she'd estimated. "Wages are $12 a month and board, if that's agreeable." "That's agreeable." He nodded once. He moved to the door and then stopped without turning around. "Thank you," he said, "for Caleb." Evelyn looked at the baby sleeping in the crib, that small, flushed face that had lost a little of its terrible heat, those small hands that had finally unclenched in sleep. "He's easy to help," she said. Nathan left the room. She stayed where she was for a while longer, just watching Caleb breathe. That was how it started. Not with a handshake or a formal arrangement or any kind of ceremony. Just a woman who didn't leave when a man told her to, and a sick baby who needed someone to stay, and a house that had gotten very good at being empty. The first week was not graceful. Hank Briggs made his position clear on her second morning when he came to the kitchen door and found her making the kind of breakfast that required actual effort. Not the burnt salt pork and stale bread that Nathan's kitchen had apparently been producing for weeks, but real food, eggs cooked properly, biscuits that had been mixed and cut and set to bake while the fire was still building. And Briggs looked at the table like he resented it personally. "You're wasting the man's stores," he said. "I'm using what's in the larder before it goes bad." She didn't look up from the pan. "Half of what's in there is close to turning. You let things go in a kitchen and you end up spending more replacing them than you would have spent eating them." "You've been through his larder." Someone had to be. She did look up then. "When's the last time someone ordered dry goods or checked the flour for weevils?" Briggs's expression shifted in a way that told her that nobody had thought about those things in a while and that he didn't want to admit it. "You don't run this place," he said. "I'm not trying to run it. I'm trying to feed it." She turned back to the pan. "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes if your men want to eat." He left without answering, but the men ate the breakfast, all 6 of them, without much comment, which she counted as a minor victory of the practical kind. Nathan ate too, standing at the counter rather than sitting, Caleb on his hip the way she'd noticed he always carried the baby. Not like something fragile, but close, like a man who'd learned to do everything one-handed because the other hand had to hold his son. Caleb was better. The fever had broken properly by the second night, and by the third day, he was back to the noisy, demanding existence of a baby who wanted to touch everything and eat approximately every 2 hours and be held the rest of the time. He was 8 months old, she'd established by then, born in February, which meant his mother had died. Nathan hadn't said, but she'd pieced it together from things not said, from the quality of absence in the house, sometime in the early spring. She learned not to ask direct questions about Margaret Cole, not because Nathan shut her down when the subject arose, but because the way his face changed when it came up was a kind of answer that was harder to sit with than silence. She learned to work around the subject the way you'd work around a bruise, not ignoring it, just not pressing. The men remained cool for the better part of that first week. She heard things said low at the edge of the yard, the particular kind of things men said when they wanted to be heard just barely enough to sting. She learned their names without letting any of them know she'd noticed the comments. There was Briggs, of course, and beside him Dolan, who was younger and followed Briggs's lead like a man who hadn't yet figured out his own. There was an older man named Calhoun who didn't say much but watched her with the patient measuring gaze of someone making up his own mind. The others were interchangeable for the first week, just a wall of skeptical male silence that she moved around and through and didn't react to, because reaction was what they were waiting for. The livestock incident happened on the Thursday of the second week. One of the ranch's mares was in a difficult labor, had been since early afternoon, and by evening, when she went to the barn to call the men in for supper, she found Briggs and Dolan standing outside the stall looking helpless, and Calhoun inside with the mare doing what he could, and it clearly not being enough. "How long?" she said. "Since 2, Calhoun said. He didn't look up from the mare. Foals turned wrong. "Has she passed anything?" "Not enough." Evelyn set down the kettle she'd been carrying and rolled up her sleeves. Briggs said her name, her last name, sharp, like a warning, and she ignored it. She'd helped with difficult births on her father's farm. It wasn't the same as a ranch operation. A mare was not the same as a sow or a cow. But the principles were principles, and she knew enough to know what Calhoun needed from her, and she helped, steadily, without drama, doing what needed doing because it needed doing. The foal came at 20 minutes past 7 in the evening. Small, but breathing. The mare exhausted, but alive. Calhoun looked at her afterward with a different expression than she'd seen from any of the men so far. "You've done that before," he said. "Not with a horse," she said honestly. "But the idea's the same." "Could have gone bad." "It could have." She started pulling her sleeves back down. "But it didn't." He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant something. Briggs didn't say anything, but she noticed that he stopped making comments at the edge of the yard after that. Nathan found her that night sitting on the back step of the house, after Caleb was down and the kitchen was cleaned, just sitting with her hands in her lap and the night air cold and clean after the close, warm work of the barn. He came out and stood for a moment, not crowding the step, and then sat down on the step above her, which put them at roughly the same level, which she thought was either unconscious or deliberate, and she wasn't sure which. "Calhoun told me," he said. "It was Calhoun who did the hard part. I just helped." He said different. She was quiet. "I want you to know," Nathan said, "that I don't think of what you do here as—" He stopped, tried again. "You're not just a cook and a cleaning woman. I know that. I just wanted to say that." She looked out at the dark yard. She could hear one of the horses moving in the corral. Somewhere further out, a coyote said something brief and moved on. "I appreciate that," she said. "It's just the truth." She nodded. He didn't leave immediately. They sat there for a little while in the kind of quiet that happens between two people who are both tired and don't feel the need to fill the silence. And that particular quality of quiet, easy, not strained, was something she hadn't felt with anyone in longer than she'd stopped counting. She thought about that later, lying on the cot in the small back room with the mattress finally properly aired and the walls close on three sides. She thought about how she'd arrived at this place 3 days ago with a bag and a letter and nothing else, and how much had happened in 3 days, and how none of it had gone the way she might have planned it if she'd tried. She hadn't planned. She almost never did. Planning assumed you had a clear road in front of you, and she'd stopped having that kind of road when she was 23 and the man who was supposed to marry her had looked at her across a parlor in Columbus and said, politely, carefully, the way you said things when you were trying to make something cruel sound like consideration, that he'd decided she wasn't quite what he'd expected. She wasn't quite what most people expected. She'd understood that about herself for a long time. She wasn't decorative, and she wasn't docile, and she had opinions she expressed directly, and a way of standing that men who preferred women to take up less space sometimes found unsettling. She'd spent years trying to be smaller, trying to take up less, trying to be what they expected. She'd stopped. Somewhere around 30, she'd just stopped. And it had cost her some things and freed her from others. And she was 34 now, and she'd made her peace with it mostly, except on the nights when the making peace didn't quite hold, and she just felt the weight of all the rooms she'd been asked to leave or been turned away from. She'd almost been turned away from this one, too. She thought about Caleb's flushed face when she'd first seen it, about the awful, thin, exhausted quality of that crying, so worn down it had almost become silence. She thought about Nathan sitting in that chair with his hands clenched in his lap, even in sleep. She turned over on the cot and closed her eyes. She was here. That was enough for tonight. She was here, and Caleb was sleeping, and the foal was breathing, and she'd done an honest day's work, and that was more than she'd had a week ago. She was almost asleep when she heard Caleb stir down the hall, the small preliminary sounds of a baby waking, and then she heard Nathan's door open and his footsteps cross the hall, and the small sounds of a man attending to his son in the dark, and then silence again. She lay there in the dark and thought, this is a good house. It's a house that's been hurt, but it's a good house. She thought, I could make something of this place. She thought, I already am. And she slept. The second week at the Cole Ranch, Evelyn learned something important about the way grief lived in a house. It didn't stay in one room. It moved. It settled into corners you didn't expect. In the way a man reached for a coffee cup and then put it back without drinking from it. In the particular silence after Caleb laughed, as if the laugh had reminded someone of something, and the reminder landed like a stone. Grief was not a thing that stayed where you put it, and in Nathan Cole's house it was everywhere, invisible and constant as the dust that crept under the doors, no matter how often she swept. She swept anyway. That was the first thing she understood about her job here. The actual work was only half the work. The other half was doing it in a way that didn't make Nathan feel like the house he'd let fall apart was being held against him. She moved through the rooms carefully. She didn't throw things away without asking. She didn't rearrange what didn't need rearranging. When she found a basket of Margaret Cole's knitting behind the settle in the front room, needles still threaded through the last few stitches, a half-finished small sock in yellow wool, she set it gently in the top of the wardrobe in the hallway and said nothing to Nathan about it. He'd know it was there when he was ready to know. Caleb, meanwhile, recovered from the fever with the particular resilience of very small children who could be limp and burning one day and determinedly attempting to put everything they found into their mouths the next. By his second week in Evelyn's care, he had established a relationship with her that operated on his own clear terms. He wanted to be near her almost constantly. He objected loudly when she put him down. And he had developed the habit of grabbing the front of her dress whenever she picked him up, and holding on with a grip that was, for 8 months old, surprisingly firm. She didn't mind. She hadn't expected to not mind, but she didn't. The ranch work organized itself around Caleb's rhythms, which meant early mornings in the kitchen while he slept, midday work when he napped after his lunch, and the late-day tasks squeezed between the afternoon feeding and the beginning of dinner. She was busy in a way that she'd almost forgotten she could be, not the grinding, purposeless busy of a woman doing piecework in Cheyenne with nothing to show for it, but the kind of busy that had weight, that added up to something at the end of each day. The kitchen was her first real project, not because it was the most important thing, but because it was the foundation of everything else. A kitchen that worked meant the men ate, meant Nathan ate, meant there was warmth in the house from the stove fire, and something that smelled like food instead of absence. She spent the better part of the second week getting it fully functional, restocking the larder by going through what remained and making a careful list, fixing the draft problem in the stove flue that had been making the fire burn unevenly, and reorganizing the shelves so that things were where they should be and therefore findable, which sounds obvious and is in fact something that is never obvious until it isn't true. She sent the list with Dolan when he went into Grace Falls for supplies, because Dolan was the one Nathan most often sent on errands, and because sending it with Briggs felt like pushing her luck. Dolan came back with most of what was on the list, and a look on his face that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what peppercorns were for, but had bought them because she'd written them down. "Thank you," she told him. He shrugged, but he wasn't cold the way he'd been the first week, and she counted that. The more serious problem, the one she'd been circling for 2 weeks before she said anything, was the account books. She hadn't been looking for them. She'd been cleaning the desk in the front room, which was buried under a drift of papers that had been accumulating since roughly March based on the dates she could read, and she'd started organizing them simply because a buried desk was a desk nobody could use. And that was when she realized that what she was looking at was not just a pile of unsorted correspondence. There were invoices in there that hadn't been responded to. There were supply accounts that hadn't been reconciled in months. There was a letter from a bank in Laramie dated 6 weeks ago that had been opened and then set down and apparently not thought about since. She stacked everything carefully. She didn't read the bank letter, but she couldn't unsee that she'd seen it. She told Nathan about the desk that evening, after Caleb was down. "I was cleaning the front room," she said. "The desk needed organizing. I've stacked everything, but I didn't read your correspondence. I want you to know that." Nathan was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he'd been nursing since dinner. He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read. Not quite embarrassed, not quite resigned. Something in between that had more layers to it than either of those things. "I know it's behind," he said. "I'm not criticizing. I'm telling you so you know where things are." She sat down across from him. She'd learned that standing when she talked to Nathan put him in a position of being looked down at, which made him defensive in a way that wasn't useful. She'd figured that out in the first week. "Is there someone who helps you with the accounts? A bookkeeper?" "Jim Farley used to do it. He left in April." "Has anyone replaced him?" Nathan wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Not yet." She waited. "I know how to manage a ranch," he said, and there was an edge in it, not at her exactly, but at the situation. "I've been doing it since I was 19. I know the land and the stock and the men. The paperwork is—" He stopped. "It's different," she said. "It's a different kind of work." "I can help with it." She said it evenly, not making it an offer he had to feel grateful for, just stating it like information. "I'm not a trained bookkeeper, but I can add figures and organize correspondence, and I understand enough about accounts to catch errors. If you want to keep the management decisions yourself, which you should, I can do the clerical part." He looked at her across the table. "You didn't advertise for that in the notice," she added. "I know, but it needs doing, and I can do it, and that's usually reason enough." He drank from the coffee cup. "Where did you learn accounts?" "My father's farm, then a dry goods store in Columbus where I kept the books for 2 years." She didn't mention why she'd left the dry goods store, which was that the owner had decided after 2 years that she knew too much about the business for his comfort, which was the kind of thing that happened to women who were good at things men hadn't expected them to be good at. I'm not suggesting anything beyond the clerical work. Your business is your business. Nathan set the cup down. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough she thought he might not answer. I'll show you the books tomorrow, he said. If you're willing. I'm willing. She stood up and went to check the stove damper for the night. Behind her, she heard Nathan push back from the table, heard the familiar sound of him going down the hall to check on Caleb the way he did every night before bed, the way she'd come to think of as the period at the end of each day's sentence. The books were worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which was not the same as being all right. What she found when Nathan spread them on the desk the next morning was a ranch operation that had been, before March, solidly managed. Records kept carefully, accounts settled regularly. A man who knew where his money went and kept track of it with the kind of methodical attention that built lasting operations. And then March, and the books had simply stopped. There were receipts stuffed loosely into the pages, unrecorded. There were invoices unpaid, not because there wasn't money, but because the act of recording them required a man to sit at a desk and think in a straight line, and grief, she knew, was the enemy of straight lines. She didn't say any of this to Nathan, she just sat down and started. She worked through the backlog over 3 days, an hour or two each evening after Caleb was sleeping, and she brought Nathan the summary on a Thursday night and went through it with him without editorializing, just the numbers, just what was owed and what was outstanding and what could be reconciled without complication. He listened and asked 3 sharp, specific questions that told her he understood everything she was presenting, that his mind was entirely capable of all of this, that the only thing wrong had been the energy to begin. The Farley account, he said, pointing to a line she'd flagged. I think it's an error. The amount doesn't match the corresponding invoice. I didn't want to record it without checking with you. He looked at it for a moment. You're right. The invoice was wrong when it came in and I didn't catch it. Do you want me to write to correct it? He glanced at her. Can you? Yes. Then write it. She wrote it that night and 3 others besides, and by the end of the week the correspondence pile on the desk had been reduced to 3 letters requiring Nathan's direct response, which she left for him in a neat stack with a brief note summarizing each one so he could answer them in order of urgency. She'd made the note because she'd noticed that he dealt with things better when the complexity was stripped away, not because he wasn't intelligent, but because an exhausted man looking at a pile of problems tends to not see them as distinct problems, just as one large and shapeless one. He found the note on Saturday morning and read it standing at the desk and then came to the kitchen doorway and said, "This is useful." And she said, "Good." And that was the entire conversation, but the quality of it was different from earlier conversations. Easier, less provisional, like something had been agreed on without being stated. Calhoun was the first of the ranch hands to fully shift in her direction. It happened slowly, the way real things do, not in a single moment, but across a series of small ones. The mare and foal had been the first. After that, there were other things. She'd noticed that Calhoun's saddle stitching was failing along one flank, had mentioned it to him without making an occasion of it, and he'd thanked her and fixed it before it became a problem. She'd started putting his coffee out first in the mornings, having figured out early that he rose before the others. Small things. The kind of things you did when you paid attention. One morning he stopped by the kitchen when she was alone and said, without particular preamble, "You're good with the baby." "He's easy," she said, which was not entirely true but was the kind of answer that closed off certain conversations gracefully. "He wasn't sleeping right before you came," Calhoun said, "crying half the night. Men could hear it from the bunkhouse." He poured himself coffee and didn't look at her directly. "It's better now." "He's sleeping through," she agreed. "Mr. Cole's sleeping through too." He picked up the cup. "First time in months, best I can tell." She didn't say anything. "I'm just saying," Calhoun said, "that some of us can see what you're doing here, even if we didn't say so at the start." He left the kitchen, and that was all. She stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone and felt something that was not quite pride, but was related to it. The particular feeling of being seen accurately, which was different from being praised and different again from being judged. and which she'd found was rarer than either. Briggs was the one she was going to have to deal with eventually. She'd known it since the first morning. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was the kind of man who organized the world around clear categories, and she'd arrived failing to fit any of the ones he used for women, and that made him uneasy in a way he'd converted into obstruction because obstruction was more comfortable than unease. He didn't give her outright trouble after the foal incident, but he worked around her in ways that created friction, talking to Nathan about things she'd already handled, re-giving instructions she'd given, positioning himself as the authoritative source of information about the ranch in conversations where she was present as if she were not there. She let it go for 2 weeks. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, she didn't. She'd been in the yard assessing the state of the kitchen garden, which had gone to seed and needed significant attention if it was going to produce anything useful before the fall. And Briggs had come out and told Dolan, right in front of her, to move the fence post she'd asked Dolan to move 2 hours ago, making it sound like it was his idea. She waited until Dolan had gone. Then she said, "Hank?" Briggs turned around. He didn't like her using his first name. She knew that. She used it deliberately, because calling him Briggs placed him in a different category than calling him Hank, and she needed them to be on the same flat ground for this conversation. "If you have a problem with the way I'm managing the household, take it to Nathan," she said. "If you have a problem with me personally, say it to my face, but don't give my instructions over as your own. It wastes everyone's time." He stared at her. "You don't give me instructions." "I gave Dolan instructions that fell within my area of responsibility, and you gave them over as yours. That's what I'm saying." She kept her voice level. "I'm not trying to run the ranch. I'm not interested in your job. But I do have work to do, and it goes better when it isn't being undone." "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "You don't know this ranch." "I know it better than I did 3 weeks ago, and I'll know it better still in another 3. That's how work goes." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not your enemy, Hank. I don't have any reason to be. But I will do the job I'm here to do, and I'll do it with or without you making it harder." He left without answering, which she expected. Men like Briggs didn't capitulate in the moment. They went away and thought about it and came back with a different posture that didn't quite acknowledge they'd changed anything. He came back the next day with a slightly different posture. Not warm, not an apology, but the obstruction stopped, and she counted that too. Caleb took his first crawling steps, not real crawling, more of a determined dragging and lunging motion, on a Tuesday morning in early October in the middle of the kitchen floor, while Evelyn was cutting bread and Nathan was finishing his coffee before heading out. And the two of them watched it happen in the particular arrested silence of people seeing something small and significant. And Nathan laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, genuine. The kind of laugh that happened before a person could decide whether to have it. He looked immediately like he wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he'd done it, and she looked back down at the bread she was cutting and didn't comment, because the wrong comment at the wrong moment can close a door that had just begun to open. Caleb, for his part, looked up at his father with the confused delight of someone who had just caused something good without fully understanding how, and then resumed his determined cross-kitchen navigation. "He's going to be trouble," Nathan said when his voice was back to regular. "He already is," she said. "He got into the flour this morning." "How?" "I'm still not entirely sure. He's creative." Nathan looked at his son with an expression she'd seen on his face a handful of times, helpless and fond, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name, something that had to do with Margaret, and the fact that Margaret would never see this and he was seeing it alone. Except he wasn't quite seeing it alone. She thought about saying that. She decided not to. Nathan stood and carried his cup to the wash basin and set it there and put his hat on and said, as he was going through the door, "Thank you for breakfast, Evelyn." He'd started using her first name somewhere in the 3rd week, so gradually she hadn't noticed exactly when it had begun. She said, "You're welcome, Nathan," and meant both words separately, which was how she meant most things. The afternoon that tested her most that month was not dramatic in the way she might have expected. There was no crisis with the livestock, no confrontation with Briggs, no emergency that required her to be competent in a visible and impressive way. It was a Saturday, and the men were occupied with their own things, and Nathan had ridden out to the far pasture to check on fencing, and it was just her and Caleb in the house, which was usually fine. It wasn't fine that afternoon. She'd gotten barely any sleep the night before because Caleb had been fussing from teething, and she'd gotten up with him twice, and by mid-afternoon she was running on tiredness and yesterday's coffee and the accumulated weight of 5 weeks of being the person who held things together. And Caleb was having one of his genuinely difficult days where nothing was right and everything was worth crying about, and she sat on the floor of the kitchen with him in her lap and her back against the cabinet, and she thought, with a clarity that the exhaustion made somehow sharp, "What am I doing here?" Not in despair, just in the plain, uninflected way of a question. What was she doing here, in this house, in this kitchen, in a life that was not hers, caring for a child she had no formal claim on, in a state she'd arrived in not quite knowing what she was looking for? Caleb put his hands on her face. He did this sometimes. Grabbed her face with both hands the way babies do, tactile, direct, with no concept of personal space. His hands were small and warm and slightly damp, as baby hands usually were, and he looked at her with the direct, unselfconscious scrutiny of someone who had not yet learned to look at anything obliquely. She put her hand over one of his. She thought, This is what I'm doing here. It wasn't an answer that would satisfy anyone who asked for a logical explanation. It was just a fact, the way some things were just facts. You stayed because you couldn't leave, not for any reason you could diagram or defend, just because the leaving was unthinkable, and the staying was the only thing that made sense. Caleb made a small sound that was not quite a word. "I know," she said. "Me too." She sat there on the kitchen floor until the worst of the afternoon tiredness passed, and then she got up and put Caleb on her hip and started dinner. Nathan came back from the pasture at dusk. He came into the kitchen, smelling of horses and cold air, and set his hat on the hook, and something about the quiet of the house, dinner on the stove, Caleb in his chair gnawing on a piece of dried apple, the fire doing what a fire was supposed to do, made him stop for a moment in the doorway and just stand there. She was stirring something on the stove, and she felt him stop, felt the quality of the pause, and she said, without turning around, "The far fence. How bad is it?" "Third post is rotting," he said. "I'll need Calhoun and Dolan out there Monday. I'll tell them at breakfast." He moved into the room and sat down at the table, and Caleb turned and made a reaching motion toward him, and Nathan lifted his son out of the chair and settled him against his chest with the ease of habit. "You had a long day," he said. She glanced back at him. "What makes you say that?" "You've got flour on your ear." She put her hand up automatically, and he was right. There was flour there, and she had no idea how long it had been there, and she felt a flush of something that was probably tiredness, and probably also mild embarrassment, but that she covered over with, "Caleb's been helping with the bread again." "I thought you were going to keep him out of the flour." "I was. He has opinions about that plan." Nathan looked down at his son and back up at her, and there it was again. That brief easiness, like a window opened for just a moment before someone remembered to close it. She turned back to the stove. She thought, "This house is getting harder to leave, and I haven't even tried yet." She thought, "That should probably concern me more than it does." The answer it gave her back was quiet and completely unhelpful, the way true things were sometimes quiet. She stirred the pot in the kitchen filled with the smell of something cooking, and outside the Wyoming dark came down over everything and held the house in the particular way that dark did out here, total and enormous, and somehow, with the fire going and the lamp lit and a baby making small sounds and a man sitting at a table, less frightening than it used to seem. The Hargrove family arrived on a Wednesday, which Evelyn would later think was fitting, because Wednesdays had always seemed to her the kind of day that didn't belong fully to either half of the week. Uncertain, neither beginning nor end, the kind of day things happened on that you hadn't prepared for. There were two of them, a man and a woman, arriving in a buggy that was nicer than anything Grace Falls usually saw on its main street, the kind of vehicle that announced itself before the people in it had to say a word. She saw them from the kitchen window, saw them pull up to the front of the house and climb down with the particular deliberate movements of people who had decided in advance how this visit was going to go. She'd never seen them before, but she knew who they were before Nathan told her, the same way you sometimes knew the weather before you looked at the sky. Nathan met them at the door. She stayed in the kitchen with Caleb on her hip and listened to the voices in the front room without being able to make out the words, just the shape of them. The man's voice flat and carrying, the woman's higher and with something clipped in it, and Nathan's underneath both, careful in a way she'd learned meant he was working to stay that way. After a few minutes, he came to the kitchen doorway. "Evelyn," he said, "would you take Caleb for a bit?" She looked at his face. He wasn't asking her to leave. He was asking her to take Caleb somewhere that wasn't the front room, which was a different thing, but the distinction wasn't one she was going to argue in the moment. "Of course," she said. She took Caleb to the back of the house and sat with him on the floor of the small room off the hallway that had been used for storage and was becoming, slowly and without formal announcement, something more like a play space as Caleb became more mobile and more determined. She listened. The voices in the front room were audible without being clear, and she wasn't trying to hear the words. She was listening to the shape of the conversation, the rhythm of it, and what the rhythm told her after about 20 minutes was that it was not going well. When Nathan appeared in the doorway, his face had a controlled quality that she'd only seen once before, the day she'd told him about the bank letter, when he'd gone very still and very level as a way of managing something underneath that was neither still nor level. "Those are Margaret's parents," he said, "Harlan and Cecilia Hargrove." She'd thought so. She said, "All right." "They want to see Caleb." "Of course they do." She stood up with Caleb and followed Nathan back down the hall. Harlan Hargrove was a tall man going gray at the temples with the look of someone accustomed to being the largest presence in any room he entered. His wife Cecilia was small and sharply dressed and had the kind of face that had probably been beautiful once and had converted that beauty, as it faded, into something harder and more deliberately maintained. They were both looking at Caleb with an intensity that had nothing to do with warmth. Cecilia reached for Caleb immediately, arms out, not a question. Caleb looked at her with the frank suspicion of a baby who had strong opinions about strangers and turned his face into Evelyn's shoulder. Something shifted in Cecilia's expression. "He doesn't know us," she said. She said it to Nathan, not to Evelyn. It's been a difficult year," Nathan said. "He should know his grandparents." Cecilia's eyes moved to Evelyn. They had that particular quality of a woman assessing another woman without any pretense of not doing it. "This is the hired woman?" "This is Evelyn Hart," Nathan said. "She manages the household. She's been here since September." Harlan looked at Evelyn the way his wife was looking at her. The same assessment, different calculation behind it. "We weren't told you'd hired a woman." "I didn't think it required telling." "It might have been appropriate," Harlan said, "given the situation." "The situation," Nathan said, and there was something under the words that he was keeping there, "is that I have an infant son and a working ranch. Miss Hart has been managing both ably." "I'm sure she has," Cecilia said, in a voice that meant nothing of the kind. Evelyn said nothing. She stood with Caleb and let them look at her, and she looked back, level, and she did not give them the discomfort or the flinching they were clearly accustomed to producing in people. Caleb eventually consented to being held by his grandmother, on his own terms and timeline, which Evelyn could have told Cecilia would happen if she'd simply waited instead of reaching. Cecilia held him with more competence than Evelyn had expected, and Caleb endured it with the polite resignation of a child who has learned that some things are unavoidable. The visit lasted 2 hours. When the Hargroves left, the quality of silence they left behind was different from the regular silence of the house, denser, with things unsaid still in it. Nathan stood at the window and watched the buggy go. "They live in Laramie," he said. "I knew they'd come eventually. Margaret was their only daughter." He paused. "Harlan built a mercantile empire, and he's been managing things ever since, including Margaret before we married. He never quite forgave me for taking her out here." "Did she want to be out here?" Evelyn asked. Nathan turned from the window. The question seemed to catch him slightly off guard, the way honest questions did when someone had expected something easier. "She did," he said. "She liked the ranch. She wasn't as fragile as her father believed." A pause. "He never believed that about her." "And now he believes he has a say in Caleb." "He'll try to," Nathan said. "That's why they came. Not just to see him, to look at the situation." His eyes moved briefly to her and away. "And to look at you." She'd understood that. "What will they do?" "I don't know yet." He moved away from the window. Harlan doesn't do anything without a plan. He was right about that, and the plan made itself known 11 days later in the form of a letter from a solicitor in Laramie addressed to Nathan, which arrived with the Thursday post and which Nathan brought to the kitchen that evening and set on the table between them without comment. She didn't pick it up. It wasn't hers to read. "They're petitioning for guardianship," he said. "Partial, quarterly visits with Caleb in Laramie, extended to full summer residency when he's older. The language is—" He stopped. "It's very careful language. It says the child's current living situation lacks appropriate maternal supervision." She heard the phrase land. She felt it land. "It says that," she said. "It implies it. The lawyer's been careful about what it says directly." He looked at her. "They're saying that a hired housekeeper is not an adequate substitute for family." She understood what was happening. She'd understood it the moment Cecilia Hargrove's eyes had moved over her in that front room, that assessing look that had nothing to do with what she actually saw, and everything to do with the category she'd already placed Evelyn in before she'd walked through the door. Hired woman. Nobody. Placeholder. "Are they right?" she said. Nathan frowned. "What? Legally, is there a case?" Harlan's a wealthy man with a lawyer who knows how to write letters. Whether there's a case or not may not be the relevant question. He sat down. He looked tired in the old way, the way he'd looked the night she'd arrived. Not the current tired of a busy man, but the deeper tired of someone carrying something that didn't have a set-down place. "Nathan," she waited until he looked at her. "What do you want to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want my son to know his mother's family," he said. "I've always wanted that. I never tried to keep them away, but I will not have someone else decide how Caleb is raised. Then we fight the letter. It's not that simple. Harlan will have been to talk to people in Grace Falls already. He's that kind of man. He'll have been building a picture." She thought about that. Grace Falls, the people who'd watched her arrive, who'd seen her at the general store buying supplies on the ranch's account, who'd made their own assessments. "What kind of picture?" she said, though she suspected she already knew. "That you're not what you present yourself as." He said it flatly, not unkindly, just the words. That there's something improper in the arrangement, a single man and a single woman alone in a house. He looked at the letter. They won't say it crudely, but that's the picture. She sat with that for a moment. It wasn't a surprise. She'd known, in some part of her that she'd kept quiet, that this kind of judgment was possible, was probably inevitable. She'd chosen not to think about it because the work had been too immediate and too real to leave room for it. Now it was in the room with them, sitting on the table in the form of a lawyer's careful letter. "Is it affecting how you see the situation?" she asked. She kept her voice level. "Honestly," he looked at her straight. "No. Some people in your position would find it easier to let me go. Some people in my position," he said, "would have let Briggs turn you away at the gate." He pushed the letter to the side like it was something he was done looking at. "I'm not concerned with the easiest thing, Evelyn. I'm concerned with the right thing." She nodded. She didn't trust herself to say much more than that. What happened in Grace Falls over the next 2 weeks was the particular kind of social campaign that wealthy families had always been able to conduct in small towns, which was quiet and pervasive and difficult to directly address because it never quite came out in the open where you could see it whole. The Hargroves had connections. Margaret had grown up partly in Laramie, but her family was known in the region, and Harlan Hargrove knew how to make his version of things the version people heard first. She felt it when she went into town, in the way conversations paused at her entrance and resumed at a different register when she left, in the way Mrs. Aldridge at the dry goods store served her with a politeness that had a new stiffness in it, in the way 2 women she'd spoken to pleasantly at the post office 3 weeks ago now had business on the other side of the street when they saw her coming. She went about her errands. She said good morning to people who said it back and to people who didn't. She bought what was on the list. She loaded the buckboard and she drove back to the ranch, and she did not let any of it show until she was alone in the kitchen and the door was closed, and then she stood at the counter for a few minutes and just breathed. Calhoun came in for his coffee and found her standing there and read the situation with the silent accuracy of a man who'd been watching things for a long time. "Town giving you trouble?" he said. "I can manage town." He poured his coffee and didn't push it. Then he said, Hargrove came out here last week, when you were in Laramie with Nathan. She looked up. What? Came to the bunkhouse, talked to the men, asked questions about how things ran here, what he called the domestic arrangements. Calhoun's voice was careful, but she could hear what was underneath it. Briggs talked to him. She felt something go cold and then make herself stop feeling it because cold wasn't useful right now. What did Briggs say? I don't know exactly. I wasn't in it. Dolan told me later. He drank his coffee. Dolan told him to mind his own business, for what it's worth. Dolan's come around. And Briggs? Calhoun set down the cup. Briggs has his opinions about what belongs where, he said. You know that. She did know that. I told Nathan, Calhoun said. He should know Hargrove was here talking to the men. That's not something that should happen without him knowing. What did Nathan say? Said he'd deal with Briggs. Calhoun picked up the cup again. Don't know that he has yet, but he will. She found out the following day that Nathan had, in fact, dealt with Briggs. In the direct and private way Nathan dealt with most serious things. No audience, no drama, no aftermath that anyone could describe exactly. What she knew was that Briggs came to breakfast the next morning with the particular expression of a man who had been told something he didn't like and had decided, on reflection, to accept it because the alternative was worse. He looked at Evelyn across the kitchen and said, Morning, Miss Hart, in a voice that was neither warm nor hostile, just present. She said, Morning, Hank, and put his breakfast in front of him. Dolan caught her eye briefly across the table and looked quickly away, which was as close as Dolan got to solidarity. The meeting in town happened on a Saturday in late November. She hadn't planned it. She'd gone to Grace Falls for supplies and to post 2 letters on the ranch's behalf, and she'd come out of the post office to find Cecilia Hargrove on the boardwalk 20 feet away, which was either coincidence or not, and with Cecilia was another woman Evelyn didn't know, and 2 men she recognized as people she'd seen with Harlan. Cecilia looked at her the same way she had in the front room of the ranch house, that total and measuring look. Miss Hart, she said. Mrs. Hargrove. Shopping for the ranch? Yes. Cecilia glanced at the woman beside her, some private communication that Evelyn was meant to see and not be part of. You're very dedicated, she said, for a hired woman. Evelyn looked at her calmly. I'm dedicated because Caleb deserves it, not because of what I'm called. Caleb. Cecilia repeated the name like it was something she was taking back. He's my daughter's son. I want you to understand that clearly. I understand it. I don't think you do. Cecilia's voice had dropped, not from privacy but from the register women used when they were saying something they wanted to land without witnesses getting the full shape of it. I don't know what you think you're building out there, or what arrangement you think you have, but you are an employee. You can be replaced. Evelyn held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, I know what I am, Mrs. Hargrove. The question worth asking is what Caleb needs. And what Caleb needs right now is consistency and warmth, and someone who's there when he wakes up crying at 2 a.m. I've been that person for 3 months. Your petition won't change that by moving him somewhere else. It'll only take away what's already working. Cecilia's expression shifted, not softened, but shifted the way things shifted when an argument had landed somewhere real and the other person knew it had. You have no legal standing with that child, she said. I know that too. Then you know how this ends. Evelyn picked up her parcels. I know how most things end, she said. I've been surprised before. She walked past Cecilia and the 2 men and the unnamed woman and got in the buckboard and drove out of Grace Falls without looking back. She was 3 miles out of town before her hands stopped being tight on the reins. She made herself breathe, made herself look at the road and the sky and the particular shade of gray-brown the land turned in November, and she thought about Caleb learning to pull himself up on the side of the crib that morning, the sheer determined outrage on his face every time his legs gave out, the way he grabbed the crib rail and hauled himself up again before she could even register he'd fallen. She thought, that's the appropriate response. That night, after Caleb was sleeping and the house was quiet, she sat down at the kitchen table and she wrote, Not a letter to the Hargroves. Not anything for Nathan to see. Just for herself. A record, in her own hand, of everything she had done in this house since September. The medical care during the fever, the accounts, the meals, the mending, the foal, the twice-nightly wakings during the teething, the weights and the milestones and the dates. All of it, dated, specific, in her plain, clear handwriting that didn't make claims beyond what was true. She didn't know if she'd ever use it. She didn't know what form the Hargroves' legal action would take, or what Nathan would decide, or how any of this would resolve. But she knew that the truth was specific, and that specific things were harder to argue with than vague impressions, and she was not willing to be replaced by a vague impression of herself. Nathan found her still writing at close to midnight. He'd come for water and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and at the papers on the table. "What is that?" he said. "A record." She looked up. "Of everything I've done here since I arrived. Dated, in case it's useful." He came into the kitchen and looked at the pages without picking them up. She could see him reading the top sheet, the dates in September, the fever, the exact medications, and the schedule, the times she'd been up at night. "You wrote all of this from memory?" he said. "I have a good memory for details." He was quiet for a moment. "Evelyn, I know it's not legal standing. I know it's not the same as Evelyn." He said her name again, differently, and she stopped. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the papers, and then at her, and then he said very simply, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to take your time answering it." She waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the petition, about what it's based on, about what a judge in Laramie is going to see when Harlan Hargrove puts this in front of him." He put his hands flat on the table. "The concern about the arrangement, the impropriety they're implying. It's not a concern if the arrangement is different." She looked at him. "I'm not saying this the right way," he said. "Say it however you need to." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not asking because of the petition. I want to be clear about that. I'm asking because I've been trying not to ask for 2 months, and the petition has made me stop pretending I have time for that." He looked up at her. "I'm asking because when you came out of the front room with Caleb and faced Cecilia Hargrove, I watched you and I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought, this is the woman who is actually here. This is the woman who stayed." She didn't say anything. "I'm not a man who makes speeches," he said. "I'm aware this is not a speech. I'm aware it's a poor substitute for one." He held her gaze. "Would you consider marrying me, Evelyn? Not as an arrangement, as a real thing, because I think it would be real." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about all the ways she could answer this. She thought about the practical truth that it would resolve the Hargrove petition. She thought about the fact that he'd said not as an arrangement, which meant he'd thought about the distinction and chosen the harder thing to offer, which was the honest thing. She thought about Caleb hauling himself up on the crib rail in the dark, that small, furious determination. She thought about the night she'd arrived with nothing and a letter and had walked past a foreman who told her she didn't belong. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy to live with. I have opinions and I say them and I don't stop saying them when I'm tired." "I know that," he said. "I've been living with it for 3 months. And I'm not interested in being managed. I've noticed that as well. And I will not have anyone, Harlan Hargrove or Cecilia or anyone in this town or on this ranch, treat me as something lesser because they've decided what kind of woman I am before they know me." "Neither will I," Nathan said. "That's not a guarantee things will be easy. It's a guarantee that I'll stand with you." She looked at him. She looked at the pages on the table between them, all those careful dates and details, her own handwriting in the lamplight, this record she'd made of herself because she'd needed there to be one. She said, "Yes." He let out a breath. She hadn't known he'd been holding it, but he had, and the release of it was so human and unguarded that she felt something in her own chest release in response, some held thing she hadn't known she was gripping. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. They sat across the kitchen table in the near midnight quiet of the house, with the fire low and Caleb sleeping down the hall and the Wyoming dark pressing against the windows, and neither of them reached across the table or made a gesture that was in any way dramatic, because neither of them was that kind of person. She gathered her papers and stacked them neatly. He sat there, and she thought he might say something else, but he didn't, and she thought that was probably right, that there wasn't anything to add. She stood up to bank the fire for the night. "Evelyn," he said. She looked back. "I meant what I said. All of it." She said, "I know you did. That's why I said yes." She banked the fire, and he went to check on Caleb, the same as every night, the same period at the end of the same sentence. Except it wasn't quite the same sentence anymore, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it sat quietly in the house like a lamp left burning. They told the men the next morning. Not in the way of an announcement. Nathan wasn't built for announcements, and Evelyn had no interest in making anyone sit through one. It was simply that when Calhoun came in for his early coffee and found Nathan already at the table with his own cup, still there, in the way that meant he hadn't been to bed or had and come back, and Evelyn at the stove with the particular quietness of someone who'd made a decision and was living inside it now, Calhoun looked at the two of them and read the room the way he read most things, without hurry and without needing anyone to explain. "Something happened," he said. It wasn't a question. "We're getting married," Nathan said. He said it simply, the way he said most things that mattered. Calhoun set his cup down. He looked at Evelyn, and then at Nathan, and then at his coffee, and then he said, "Well," which was Calhoun's version of a great deal, and picked the cup back up. The other men found out through the ordinary channels. Calhoun told Dolan, Dolan told the others, and by breakfast everyone at the table knew and was working out how to behave about it, which resulted in a particular charged silence that Evelyn moved through without comment, setting plates down and refilling coffee and not making anyone perform a reaction they hadn't finished having yet. Dolan said quietly when she passed, "Congratulations, Miss Hart." He looked at the table when he said it. "Thank you, Dolan." Briggs said nothing. He ate his breakfast and left. She didn't follow that thread any further because it would only go somewhere she already knew. What she turned her attention to instead, that morning and the several that followed, was the practical reality of the situation, which was more complicated than the word marriage suggested. There was the Hargrove petition to address, which meant a response had to be prepared, which meant a lawyer. Nathan rode to Laramie 2 days after and came back with a man named Aldous Croft, who had an office above the bank and the careful manner of a man who had learned not to show his opinions about his client's circumstances. Croft reviewed the petition at the kitchen table, which was where all serious business seemed to happen in this house. Evelyn sat at the table too. Nathan had asked if she wanted to be there, and she'd said yes without having to think about it, because she was not going to manage this situation from the other side of a closed door. Croft read the papers and then looked at both of them over the top of them. The guardianship petition as filed is based on 2 grounds. First, that the child's maternal grandparents have a familial interest in his welfare and development. Second, that the current domestic situation is, he found the phrase, insufficiently stable to ensure appropriate moral supervision for a child of tender years. "Define insufficiently stable," Nathan said. "An unmarried man living alone with a female employee and an infant child." Croft set the pages down. "It's implication, not accusation. Carefully phrased to avoid defamation while producing the desired inference in a judge's mind." "We're getting married," Nathan said. Croft looked at him. "When?" "As soon as it can be arranged." "That changes the petition significantly. A married household with a stable domestic arrangement is a different picture than what they've described here." He tapped the pages. "It won't invalidate the familial claim. The Hargroves have a legitimate interest in the child as his maternal grandparents, and no judge is going to sever that entirely, but it removes their strongest argument." "What do we need to do?" Evelyn asked. Croft looked at her in the particular way people looked at her in legal or formal settings, working out which category she fell into before deciding how to address her. She waited and let him finish the calculation. "I'll need documentation of the marriage as soon as it occurs," he said to both of them, which was the right answer. "I'll also want anything that establishes Miss Hart's, Mrs. Cole's, involvement in the child's care. Medical records, dates, witnesses." She reached under the edge of the table and lifted the papers she'd been keeping. She set them in front of him. "I've kept a record since September. Dates, circumstances, specific care provided. I have 2 witnesses on the ranch, Calhoun and Dolan, who were present for a number of the events documented." Croft looked at the pages. He He looked at her. He said, "You anticipated this." "I anticipated something," she said. "I didn't know exactly what." He took the pages and read them with an attention she recognized as genuine, not performative, the reading of a man processing information rather than checking a box. When he finished, he stacked them carefully and said, "This is useful. This is genuinely useful." He said it like it surprised him, which she decided not to take personally. The marriage was arranged for the second Saturday in December, at the county clerk's office in Grace Falls, with Calhoun as witness because he was the appropriate choice, and because he'd said yes without any of the awkward hesitation that would have made the asking harder. The ceremony was brief and entirely without ceremony in the decorative sense. The clerk read the words. They said the words that needed saying, and that was that. Caleb slept through it, bundled against Evelyn's chest in the length of wool she'd taken to using to carry him when her hands needed to be free, his face slack and warm with the total unconsciousness of a baby who had decided this was a good moment for a nap, regardless of what the adults around him were doing. The clerk, a man named Fowler, who had deep-set eyes and the permanent look of someone who found most things mildly disappointing, watched Evelyn sign the register and then looked at the baby and then at her and said, "Congratulations," in a voice that managed to contain multiple things at once. "Thank you," she said clearly, and handed him back the pen. Calhoun shook Nathan's hand outside on the boardwalk and clapped him once on the shoulder, which was as expansive as Calhoun got. He touched his hat to Evelyn. She thought she saw something in his face that was as close to moved as Calhoun was capable of looking, which was not very close but was there. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Wyoming December quiet. The sky, the particular gray of a day that can't decide between clouds and clearing, the road hard under the wheels, Caleb still sleeping. Nathan drove and she sat beside him, and neither of them felt the need to fill the miles with talking, which had become one of the things she valued about being with him. The silences that didn't require explanation. Halfway back he said, without looking at her, "Are you all right?" She thought about the question honestly before she answered it. "Yes," she said. "I'm not sure exactly what I expected to feel, and I'm not sure what I do feel, but I think I'm all right." "That seems about right," he said. "It's not a very romantic answer." "No," he agreed, "but it's an honest one." She looked at the road and the cold flat land and the sky trying to make up its mind. "I was married once before," she said. She hadn't told him this. She'd thought about when to tell him and had decided it was the sort of thing that should be said sooner than it became conspicuous. For 11 months, he was a lawyer in Columbus. It didn't... She stopped, chose the precise word. "It didn't suit either of us. He wanted something I couldn't be, and I wanted something he couldn't offer, and we both figured it out too late." Nathan didn't respond immediately. She gave him the time. "What did he want?" he said. "Simpler," she said. "A simpler woman." Nathan was quiet for another stretch of road. Then he said, "I'm not looking for simpler." "I know that. That's part of why I said yes." He glanced at her then, briefly, the kind of look that had too many things in it to be called just one thing, and then looked back at the road. She didn't tell him the rest of it, that the Columbus lawyer had told her on the day they agreed the marriage was done, that she was too much for most men and she'd be alone for the rest of her life. She'd believed him for longer than she should have. She'd stopped believing him, she thought, somewhere around a Tuesday in September when she'd walked past a ranch foreman who told her to leave and had decided not to. The Hargrove response came in January. Not a new legal filing. Harlan Hargrove was smarter than that. He knew the marriage had changed the ground under the petition, and a man who'd built a mercantile empire didn't throw good money after bad arguments. What came instead was a letter, addressed to Nathan, written in Harlan's own hand rather than a lawyer's, which told her something about the shift in tactics. Nathan read it at the desk and brought it to her in the kitchen that evening. "He wants to visit," he said, "formally. He's asking to be given regular access to Caleb. He's not pressing the custody question. Is he dropping the petition? He's not saying so in writing, but he's not pressing it." Nathan sat down. "He's asking for what I would have given him anyway." She looked at the letter. He's cutting his losses. He's being practical." Nathan rubbed the side of his jaw. "He's also..." In the middle of the letter, there's a line about Margaret, about how he misses her, and Caleb is all that's left of her. He paused. It's the only part of the letter that sounds like him and not like a strategy. She thought about that. She thought about Cecilia Hargrove holding Caleb in the front room, the competence of that hold, the hunger in it underneath the stiffness. He should see Caleb, she said. Nathan looked at her. He's an unpleasant man, and his wife said things to me that I won't forget quickly, she said. But Caleb is their grandchild, and they lost their daughter, and they should see him. That was always true. She met his eyes. What they did was wrong. That doesn't make what they feel wrong. Nathan was quiet for a long time. You're more generous about it than I am. I'm not generous about it. I'm just clear about which part is which. He looked at the letter again. I'll write back. Invite them for a visit. He paused. You'll be here. Of course I'll be here. I live here. He folded the letter. Something in his face shifted in a way she'd come to understand. That look of a man processing something unexpected, resettling around it. I know, I meant, you won't disappear into the kitchen when they come. I had no plans to disappear anywhere, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was adjacent to one. I know you didn't. The Hargroves came in February, on a day that was cold and clear, the sky that particular winter blue that had no warmth in it, but was beautiful in the way of things that didn't need to be warm to be real. Cecilia came in first and saw the house, which was clean and warm and had the particular quality of a place that was being genuinely lived in. And then she saw Caleb, who was 11 months old by then and pulling himself up on everything and falling and pulling up again with the same furious determination he'd had since he learned the trick of it. He looked at his grandmother from the safety of Evelyn's hip, and after a suitable period of assessment, allowed himself to be transferred, which he did with more grace than the first visit. And Cecilia held him, and this time did not look at Evelyn the same way she had before. She looked at Evelyn differently, not warmly, not with any particular evidence of a changed opinion, but differently. The look of a woman who has reconsidered her category for someone and not yet settled on a replacement. Harlan sat with Nathan and spoke to him in the front room about ranch matters and Laramie business, and Margaret, in the careful way that men spoke about things they found painful when they were not in the habit of speaking about painful things. She could hear the conversation from the kitchen without hearing the words, and she let it be private. She brought coffee. She set it down and left and came back later for the cups. It was when she came back for the cups that Harlan said, to her, with his back still partly turned, "The house is well kept." She picked up the cups. "Thank you." Margaret kept it differently. He set it to the window. She had a different approach to things. I'm sure she did. I'm not criticizing. I know, she said. He turned then and looked at her with the direct measuring look that she recognized was probably where Cecilia had learned hers. He was looking for something, and she didn't know if he was finding it or not. You care for my grandson, he said. Not a question. Yes. You understand he's Margaret's son, she said. I understand that completely. I've never thought otherwise. Something moved in Harlan Hargrove's face that she suspected very few people had seen. He looked at his hands and then at the window and then at nothing particular, and he said, she would have been, and stopped, and didn't go on, and she understood enough to know he didn't need her to respond. She took the cups to the kitchen. Cecilia found her there an hour later, standing at the window with Caleb on her hip, pointing out to him the particular way a blue jay moved in the yard, which was a game they'd developed that she wasn't sure he fully understood yet, but that he seemed to find worthwhile. He says, Ma, Cecilia said from the doorway. Evelyn turned. He started a few weeks ago. He says it to me and sometimes to Nathan, and once to the coffee pot, so I'm not entirely sure what it means to him yet. Cecilia looked at her grandson in Evelyn's arms, and something in her face was just tired. Not hostile, not strategic, just the tiredness of a woman who had lost her daughter and had spent months fighting the wrong battle, and had arrived at the other side of it with no daughter and no victory, and a grandchild who said Ma to someone else. I didn't like you, Cecilia said. I know. I still don't know if I like you. I'm not asking you to like me, Evelyn said. I'm asking for the chance to show you who I am, which is different. Cecilia looked at her. And who are you? I'm the woman who was there when Caleb had a fever that could have gone bad, I'm the woman who gets up at night when he cries, and I'm the woman who tracks what he eats and makes sure he's warm and has learned every sound he makes and what each one means. She shifted Caleb on her hip. I'm not his mother, and I know that. I will never ask him to forget that there was someone else. But I am what's here, Mrs. Hargrove, and what's here matters. Cecilia was quiet for a long time. Caleb made a grab for the collar of Evelyn's dress and held on. You're very sure of yourself, Cecilia said finally. I've had to be, Evelyn said. It's not the same thing as being certain about everything. Cecilia looked at her grandson one more time and then at Evelyn and said carefully, He seems healthy. It was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was a woman finding the smallest true thing she could say and saying it. He is, Evelyn said. He's doing very well. The Hargroves left before dark. Nathan stood at the gate and watched the buggy go and then came back to the house and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was tired in the good way, the way of a man who has carried something difficult a long distance and has finally been allowed to set it down. How did it go? He said. The kitchen part. Better than the first time. She put Caleb in his chair and started on dinner. She may never be warm to me. I'm not counting on it. But she's choosing her grandson over her position. That's enough to work with. Nathan moved into the kitchen and poured himself water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the counter, and Caleb banged on the tray of his chair with a wooden spoon he'd acquired from somewhere, and Nathan looked at his son with that look, helpless and fond, and underneath it all, the thing that was harder to name, except that now, when it surfaced, she could see that it had changed slightly, that the grief was still there, but it was sharing the space now with something else, something that hadn't been there in September. Croft sent a note, Nathan said. The petition is formally withdrawn. She stopped what she was doing. She stood at the stove for a moment with the spoon in her hand and let that land. When? This morning. I didn't want to say before they came in case something changed. He set down the water. It's done. She went back to what she was doing. She stirred what was on the stove and felt the news settle into her the way things settled when they were true. Not in a rush, just quietly, finding their level. Evelyn, she looked up. Thank you, he said, for all of it. The letter you wrote yourself before I even knew to ask for it, the way you talked to them today. He paused. The way you've talked to everyone. From the beginning. You talk to people too, she said. Not the same way. He looked at her directly. I can manage a ranch. I know cattle and land and weather. I don't always... He stopped. People are harder for me. I know that. You make it look easier than it is. It isn't easy, she said. I've just had a lot of practice at the harder version of it. She meant the version where no one gave you the benefit of the doubt, where you had to earn the room you stood in every time. She didn't say all of that. He heard it anyway. He said, I know. They ate dinner with Caleb between them in the way they always did. Caleb making a systematic mess of everything within reach, Nathan attempting to feed him things he kept throwing on the floor, and Evelyn maintaining a steady commentary about the strategic intelligence of whatever Caleb was doing at any given moment, which was a game they'd developed somewhere in the third month that neither of them had decided to start. It had just started, the way the things that become habits do. After Caleb was down, Nathan came back to the kitchen and they sat at the table the way they'd been sitting at that table since September. And the fire was low, and the lamp was lit, and the kitchen had the smell of food and warmth that it had in the evenings now. The smell she'd been creating since the first week without knowing exactly that she was creating something, just doing the work that needed doing. I want to tell you something, Nathan said. She waited. When Margaret died, he stopped. Not the way he used to stop when the subject came up, with that full closure, like a door pulled shut. He stopped like someone gathering the right words. When she died, I genuinely believed that what I had left was the ranch and Caleb, and that was what my life was going to be. The ranch and Caleb and managing, getting through each year. He looked at the table. I wasn't unhappy about it exactly. I just thought that was the shape of things now. She didn't say anything. I don't think that anymore, he said. I haven't thought it since sometime in October. He looked up. I'm not good at this. At saying it. You're doing fine. I want you to know that He stopped again, tried a different way in. That morning, you arrived. You walked past Briggs, and you knocked on my door, and you walked in, and you just dealt with what was in front of you. You didn't ask me to manage my grief in a way that made you more comfortable. You didn't pretend the hard things were simpler than they were. You just did what needed doing. That's just work, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She held his gaze. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, simply without decoration, directly, like he was stating a fact that had been true for a while and he was just now getting around to saying it out loud. I'm not sure when it started, probably earlier than I'd like to admit, but I do. The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about Columbus and the lawyer who had told her she was too much. She thought about the stage to Cheyenne and the 2 years of piecework and the folded notice in her coat pocket. She thought about walking past Briggs in the morning light with her bag in her hand and something in her chest that had been, if she was honest, less certainty and more refusal. The refusal to let one more door close her out. I'm not easy, she said. We've covered that. I'm saying it again because I need you to understand what you're signing up for beyond the immediate problem. She looked at her hands on the table. I have opinions about everything and I say them. I get angry, and when I'm angry I go quiet instead of saying so, which is its own problem. I don't forgive quickly. I keep records of things people do wrong in my head, and I take them out sometimes when I should have left them alone. She looked up at him. I'm telling you the real parts. I know the real parts, he said. I've been living with the real parts for 4 months. Then you know what you're choosing. Yes, he said. I do. She looked at him and thought, this is a good man. Not a perfect man, not a man without rough edges or silences he couldn't get past, or grief he still carried in ways he probably couldn't name. Just a good man, with a ranch and a baby, and a particular kind of steadiness that didn't announce itself, the kind that was just there, underneath everything, reliable in the way that things were reliable when they were built honestly. I love you too, she said. I've been careful about it because careful seemed right. But I do. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just that, his hand over hers, on the kitchen table where they'd been sitting since September, and the fire burned low, and Caleb slept down the hall, and the Wyoming night held the house the way it always did, total and enormous. And inside it, this one small room with its lamp and its warmth, and these two people sitting across from each other with their hands on the table. She turned her hand over and held his. That was all. That was enough. Outside, the wind picked up and moved across the open land and shook the bare branches of the 2 trees at the edge of the yard, the trees she'd come to think of as landmarks, as the things you saw from the kitchen window that told you where you were. The fire settled. The lamp held steady. She sat there and she thought, I am here. I am where I came to be. I don't know if I came here looking for this or just looking for somewhere I wouldn't be turned away from, and maybe those 2 things were never as different as I thought. Nathan didn't let go of her hand. She didn't let go of his. March came in hard that year, the way Wyoming March usually did, not with any softening of winter, but with a kind of aggressive uncertainty, warm enough one afternoon to make you think something had changed, and then cold enough by morning to remind you that nothing had, not yet, not quite. The ground was still iron hard in the early hours, and the light came later than you wanted it to, and the wind off the open land had that particular quality of something that had been traveling a long time and had not gotten gentler for it. Evelyn noticed the season the way she noticed most things now, through the work it created. The kitchen garden needed preparing for the first planting. The ranch accounts wanted reconciling for the quarter. Caleb, who was 13 months old and walking with the chaotic determination of someone who had only recently discovered the option and could not understand why anyone would choose not to, had developed a strong interest in the kitchen door and what was on the other side of it, which meant that a significant portion of her day involved the management of a small person with no sense of danger and very clear opinions about his own agenda. She didn't mind. She'd learned that minding the difficulty of something and minding the thing itself were 2 different calculations, and Caleb was worth every version of the calculation. What she minded in the March that followed the February of the Hargroves' visit and the withdrawal of the petition, and Nathan saying the thing he'd said at the kitchen table, was something she hadn't anticipated. She minded the space that opened up when the immediate crisis closed. When there was a threat to fight, the fighting organized everything. Time and energy and attention all had somewhere to go. When the threat receded, you were left standing in the quiet with yourself, and the quiet asked questions that the fighting had been helpfully drowning out. The question the quiet asked her that March was one she'd been carrying since September without fully looking at it. What did she actually want this life to be now that she was allowed to have it? Not what was necessary, not what the situation required, what she wanted. It was a harder question than it sounded. She'd spent a long time being practical about want, compressing it down into what was achievable, what was reasonable given the circumstances, what a woman in her position could expect. That compression had become habit, and habits didn't dissolve just because the circumstances changed. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning when Nathan came in from the pasture earlier than she'd expected, with a look on his face that she'd learned in 4 months was his "I need to talk to you" look, as distinct from his "I have a problem with the ranch" look, which were close cousins but not identical. He sat down at the table. She poured coffee and sat across from him. "Calhoun's leaving," he said. She hadn't seen that coming. "When?" "He told me this morning. His brother's got land in Montana, needs help working it. He's been thinking about it since fall." Nathan wrapped both hands around the cup. He wasn't going to go while things here were uncertain. He said that he wanted to see things settled first. She thought about Calhoun standing in the kitchen the morning after the Hargroves' first visit, telling her in his indirect way that some of the men could see what she was doing, telling her about Harlan Hargrove's visit to the bunkhouse, that quiet, steady presence that had been the first thing that shifted in her direction and had stayed shifted. "He's a good man," she said. "He is. I'm going to lose a lot of knowledge when he goes." Nathan drank the coffee. "He's offered to help me find a replacement. He knows men. Take him up on it." "I will." He set the cup down. "There's something else." She waited. "He asked me something this morning. Before he told me about Montana." Nathan looked at his hands around the cup. "He asked me if I was going to be all right. Not the ranch. Me. He looked at me and he said, 'Nathan, are you going to be all right?' And I told him yes." He paused. "And I meant it. That's the thing. I meant it without thinking about it first, which I wouldn't have been able to say a year ago. I wouldn't have known the answer." She didn't say anything. She understood this was something he was arriving at, not something he'd already arrived at. "I was pretty far gone when you showed up," he said. "I don't know if I've ever said that directly." "You didn't need to. I want to." He looked up at her. "Caleb was the only reason I got out of bed some mornings. Not because I wanted to, just because he needed feeding and there was no one else." His voice was level, the way it always was when he was saying something that wasn't level underneath. "I wasn't managing, I was surviving, which is different." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He held her gaze. "I'm not surviving anymore. I want you to know I understand what that means and where it comes from. It came from the accumulated weight of daily things. From breakfasts that were ready and accounts that were in order, and a baby who was thriving, and a house that was warm. From being known, specifically, accurately, without flattery, by the person who lived across the table from you." She didn't say any of this because he knew it, and saying it would make it smaller somehow, reduce it to a list when it was not a list but something whole. "Calhoun leaves at the end of the month," Nathan said. "We'll have a proper dinner before he goes." He'd hate that. "I know. We're doing it anyway." Nathan looked at her, and that adjacency to a smile happened again, which was more than she'd gotten in September and which she'd come to understand was simply what his smiles looked like. Not broad, not performed, just real in their quiet, particular way. Calhoun ate the dinner with the expression of a man being honored against his will who has decided on balance to accept it. Dolan gave a short speech that was mostly incoherent but clearly meant well. Even Briggs raised his coffee cup in something that was almost a toast, which was as close to warmth as Briggs was ever going to get, and which Calhoun received with the diplomatic straightforwardness of a man who'd been working alongside Briggs long enough to know what a raised cup cost him. Caleb sat in the middle of the table's attention and received it as his due, because Caleb had no concept of any event not being at least partly about him, which was an attitude Evelyn privately found difficult to argue with. Calhoun left on a Saturday with a bedroll, a horse, and very little else that she could see, which was consistent with everything she knew about how he moved through the world. He shook Nathan's hand at the gate and touched his hat to her and looked for a moment at the house and the yard and whatever 11 months had meant to him here, and then he got on his horse and rode north without looking back. She stood at the gate with Nathan and watched until he was a small shape against the pale March sky, and then smaller and then gone. "I'm gonna miss him," she said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "Me too." They stood there another moment in the particular silence of watching someone leave, which was its own kind of quiet and not the same as the regular quiet of the ranch. And then Caleb, inside the house, made a sound that indicated strong feelings about being left in his chair for too long, and they went back in. The man Calhoun found for the job was named Everett Birch, and he arrived in April, younger than Calhoun by a decade and a half, with a quick manner and a quicker opinion, the kind of man who filled a room at a different volume than Calhoun had, and who would take longer to trust, she thought, but who knew cattle and horses with the confidence of someone who'd been doing it a long time. He looked at Evelyn on his first morning with the same weighing look that all new men used on her, and she gave him the same thing she gave all new men, which was a direct gaze and his breakfast on time and no particular effort to win him over, because men worth having on your side generally came around on their own, and men who didn't weren't worth the campaign. He came around in the second week. She'd noticed the same thing about his coffee cup that she'd once noticed about Calhoun's. He took it first thing, and before the others, and she'd started putting it out, and he'd registered it without comment, and on a Thursday he'd said, carrying the cup past the kitchen door, "That's good coffee, Mrs. Cole." "Thank you, Everett." "My mother made it that way," he said. He didn't stop walking. He said it without apparent sentimentality, just as a statement of fact, the way competent people acknowledged competence, they recognized. She heard him. She thought about his mother, about all the women who had made things work quietly in the background of other people's lives, and who passed their knowledge down through exactly this kind of small, unannounced moment. A cup of coffee at the right time, the right temperature, without being asked. She thought, that's most of how anything important gets transmitted. Quietly, without ceremony, without anyone deciding it was worth recording. She'd been recording things. The account books were current and organized. The household records she'd been keeping since September had grown into a genuine system. Not just the medical notes she'd written in crisis, but a running log of the ranch's domestic operations, what had been planted and when, what the livestock numbers looked like each quarter, what supplies were running low, and when they'd been replenished. Nathan had started consulting it naturally, the way you consulted something you'd come to depend on without having formally decided to. She'd been thinking about the kitchen garden since March, and in April she started on it in earnest, which meant mornings outside in the cold with Caleb bundled and set in the dirt nearby, alternating between intense interest in the dirt itself and vigorous attempts to eat it, while she turned soil and set the early seeds and thought about what had been here before she came and what she wanted to be here by fall. The neighbor woman, Clara Fenn, came by in April for the first time since November. Clara Fenn was not a bad woman. She was a woman who operated within her community's expectations the way most people operated within them, not cruelly, not with specific intent to harm, but along the path of least resistance, which in November had meant a certain coolness toward Evelyn that followed the Hargrove campaign. She arrived now with a covered dish and a slightly overbright manner that Evelyn recognized as a woman making amends without quite saying so. She received her at the kitchen door and invited her in and set out coffee and did not make anything of the November coolness, because she'd meant what she'd said to Cecilia Hargrove. She didn't forgive quickly, but she understood the difference between people who acted from malice and people who acted from the pressure of their circumstances. And Clara Fenn was firmly in the second category. Clara looked around the kitchen. She looked at the order of it, the warmth, the evidence of a household that was being genuinely managed, and she looked at Caleb on the floor investigating a wooden block with total seriousness. "He's grown," she said. "They do," Evelyn said. "He looks well." Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "You both do, you and Nathan. We're getting there." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the particular awkwardness of someone making the shortest possible version of an apology, "I heard the Hargroves withdrew the petition. In February. I'm glad to hear it." She said it to the coffee cup. There was a lot being said in November, and I don't think everything that was said was fair." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It wasn't." Clara looked up. She'd expected something more forgiving, maybe, or something colder, and Evelyn had given her neither, just the plain truth, and she held it for a moment. "No," she said. "You're right." She drank the coffee. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Aldridge thinks differently about it now. She mentioned it to me last week. Said she thought you'd been treated poorly." "That's kind of her." "People come around," Claire said. "It just takes them time. When something's unfamiliar, they go with what they know instead of what they're seeing, and sometimes what they know is wrong." She looked at Caleb again. "He really does look well." "He's eating everything he can find that isn't nailed down," Evelyn said. "I consider that healthy." Clara laughed, and it was a real laugh, and after that the conversation was easier. The way conversations got easier once the difficult thing inside them had been brought out and acknowledged and set aside. After Clara left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard in its April state. Mud still, mostly, with the beginning of green at the edges of things. The bare trees she looked out at every morning starting to show the first buds, pale and tentative against the cold sky. She thought about what Clara had said. People come around. It just takes time. She'd been told that before, and she'd always met it with skepticism, because in her experience, people came around only when coming around cost them less than staying where they were. What had changed in Grace Falls was not some shift in fundamental character. It was that the Hargrove petition had failed, and she and Nathan were married, and Caleb was clearly thriving, and the situation had resolved in a way that made the earlier judgment look wrong to the people who'd held it. That was not the same as generosity. That was just people updating their information. But she thought, maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need people to be generous. Maybe you just need them to update their information eventually, and you need to be standing there with the truth when they do. She'd been standing with the truth since September. She was still standing with it. And here was April, and Clara Fenn at the kitchen table with a covered dish, and Mrs. Aldridge apparently telling people that Evelyn had been treated poorly, which was a form of vindication that was quiet and imperfect and absolutely real. Nathan came in from the south pasture that evening with a long scratch on his forearm from a fence repair that had gone sideways, not deep, but bleeding enough to need attention, which he'd wrapped in his own handkerchief in a way that was workable but not particularly effective. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table and cleaned it and bound it properly, while he sat still with the patience of a man who'd learned that objecting to being taken care of was more trouble than it was worth. "Clara Fenn came today," she said. "I know. I saw the buggy when I came in." He watched her work. "How was it?" "Useful." She tied off the bandage. She was making an indirect apology without quite calling it that. I accepted it in the same spirit. "How are you with it?" She looked at the bandage on his arm and then at him. "I'm fine with it. I'm not going to pretend that November wasn't what it was, but Clara's not my enemy and never was." She put the cloth and the kit away. "I'm more interested in the spring than in relitigating the winter." He looked at her for a moment. "You know what I like about you?" "My accounts, presumably." "Your accounts are excellent." He said it straight. "But what I mean is, you don't hold on to the wrong things. You hold on to the things worth holding and you let the rest go when you're done with it." She thought about that, about the Columbus lawyer and what he'd said and how long she'd held it, about every room she'd been asked to leave and every door closed against her that she'd carried around for years as evidence of her own inadequacy. "I'm working on it," she said. "I'm better at it than I used to be." "That's all any of it is," he said. "Working on it." Caleb chose that moment to arrive at their feet at speed, having perfected in the last 2 weeks a walking style that could only be described as a controlled fall at increasing velocity, and he grabbed his father's knee and looked up at Nathan with an expression of total urgency that meant one of about four things, none of which he could specify yet beyond the urgency itself. Nathan reached down and picked him up, bad arm and all, and Caleb grabbed his collar and looked around the kitchen from his new elevation with the satisfaction of someone who has achieved a superior position. She watched them. She thought, this is it. This is the thing right here, this specific moment, this man with his bound-up arm and his son on his hip, and this kitchen that she had built from nothing into something, this house that had been empty and was now full. She thought, I came here looking for work, and I found a life, which are not the same thing and which I could not have planned for, not really, not even if I'd tried. The life found me the same way most important things find you. Not because you aimed for them precisely, but because you kept moving in an honest direction and stayed when staying was the harder choice. May arrived, and with it the first real warmth, the kind that stayed through midday and left something behind even after it was gone. The kitchen garden came up. Not perfectly. It was never perfectly. Some of the early planting had been too early, and some of the seeds had not taken, and there was a persistent problem with something eating the lettuce that she had not yet identified. But it came up, green and real and there. Birch turned out to have an unexpected aptitude for quiet, which she valued in ranch hands. He did his work without requiring more management than the work itself required. He spoke to her with the same directness he used with Nathan, and he had a way with Caleb that was gruff and completely sincere, which Caleb responded to with instant and permanent devotion. Dolan stayed. She'd wondered in November if he would. He was young enough that the Hargrove campaign and Briggs's ambivalence might have made the ranch feel unstable in the way young men were sensitive to. But he'd stayed, and he'd said something in April that she thought about afterward. He'd told Birch, not knowing she could hear from the garden, that this was the best run outfit he'd worked on, and he wasn't going anywhere. He'd said it simply, reporting a fact. She'd kept weeding and hadn't let on that she'd heard, but she'd filed it away in the same place she filed things worth keeping. Briggs remained Briggs. He did his work. He did not obstruct her. He was never warm, and she did not expect him to be, and there was a rough functionality to their working relationship that she had made her peace with. Some men were built for certain shapes of world, and she did not fit his, and the best outcome between them was a productive distance that neither of them pretended was more than it was. She accepted this without resentment. Not every problem resolved into warmth. Some problems just resolved into workability, and workability was an honest thing. The Hargroves came in June for their first formal arranged visit. It was not easy. It was not designed to be easy, and she had not prepared herself for easy, which was probably why it went better than she'd feared. Harlan arrived with less entitlement in his posture than he'd carried in November. Not humbled, not a man who'd been brought low, just a man who'd run a calculation and come out the other side with different information than he'd started with. He walked into the house, and he saw it, really saw it, the way you could see a house that was alive as opposed to one that was surviving, and something settled in his face. Cecilia went directly to Caleb, which was right, and Caleb, 14 months old, walking, talking in the approximate way of someone who had strong opinions and limited vocabulary, looked at his grandmother and said, with great conviction, something that was almost certainly not a real word, but that he clearly felt was adequate. Cecilia laughed. It surprised everyone, including Cecilia. It was a real laugh, short and unguarded, and she looked at Caleb with a different quality of attention than she'd brought to either of the previous visits. Something raw, something that was not about Evelyn or Nathan or the situation at all, but just about this small boy with his serious face and his conviction. "Oh, Margaret," Cecilia said very quietly, to no one in particular. Evelyn heard it. She went back to the kitchen. She gave them the front room, and she didn't appear unless she was needed, and she was needed once for Caleb, who decided after an hour that he had reached his limit with visits and required rescue. She came in, and he reached for her with the directness he always used, no ambiguity about who he wanted, and she picked him up and he settled immediately against her shoulder and looked back at his grandparents with the expression of someone who had handled this situation adequately. Harlan watched this. He watched Caleb settle against Evelyn with that total ease, that animal trust that babies gave to the people who had been there every night and every morning, and she could see him working through something. Not pleasantly, but honestly. "He knows you," Harlan said. "Yes," she said. She didn't say of course he does, or make anything of it, just yes. Harlan looked at his wife and then at his grandson and then at Evelyn with the look of a man making a final calculation on something he'd been calculating for a long time. "My daughter would have wanted him to be cared for," he said. Like this. It was not an apology. Harlan Hargrove was probably not a man who apologized in the conventional sense, but it was something, and she received it as something, and she said, "I know," because she believed it was true. Not because she'd known Margaret, but because she knew Caleb, and a child who was loved that well had learned it from somewhere before September. That afternoon, in the quiet after the Hargroves had settled into their guest arrangements and Nathan had taken Harlan out to see the south pasture, and Cecilia was sitting in the front room with Caleb on the floor between them, playing with the wooden blocks that had become his current passion, Evelyn sat in the kitchen doorway and watched them. Cecilia was building a small tower of blocks, carefully, and handing them to Caleb to knock over, which Caleb did with enormous and renewable satisfaction. She was talking to him in the low, continuous way of someone who understood that the words weren't the point yet, just the sound, just the presence. She was good at it. She'd probably been good at it with Margaret. Evelyn thought she loved her daughter. Whatever else is true about Cecilia Hargrove, she loved her daughter, and she is trying to keep her alive in the only way still available, which is through this small boy who carries her forward. That is not wrong. That is just grief finding its way towards something it can hold. She thought about grief a lot that summer, in the way you thought about something that had shaped a place before you arrived in it. Not as a current thing, but as the soil that current things were growing in. Nathan's grief for Margaret had not disappeared. She'd never expected it to, and she'd never wanted it to, which was something she'd understood about herself early. That she was not trying to replace something but to be something additional, something that existed alongside rather than instead of. Margaret was in this house. She was in the yellow wool sock in the wardrobe that Evelyn had put there in October and that Nathan had found in February and held for a long time before folding it back and closing the door. She was in the way Nathan said certain things, the phrasing of a man who had been known well by someone and carried the print of it. She was in Caleb's face. Evelyn had made her peace with that too, not without work and not all at once, but genuinely in the way that real peace came, not as an absence of complication, but as a settled ability to hold the complication without being destroyed by it. The summer moved. There were good days and difficult days, and some days that were both. There was a problem with one of the wells in July that cost 2 weeks and more money than they'd budgeted and required Nathan to make decisions under pressure that he made correctly, but that took something out of him temporarily. There was a week in August when Caleb was sick again. Nothing like September, nothing frightening, just a child's summer cold that made him miserable and required 4 nights of interrupted sleep and left Evelyn and Nathan both slightly hollow-eyed and short on patience in the way that sleep deprivation made you short on patience, which was a test of a different kind than the Hargroves had been. They got through it. Not gracefully, not without some sharpness that each of them had to acknowledge after. Nathan one evening saying something dismissive about a household decision that she'd thought through carefully, and her calling him on it directly, and him sitting with that for a moment and then saying, "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm tired and I took it out in the wrong direction," which was more than she'd expected and exactly what she needed. These were the ordinary tests, the ones without drama or legal petitions or community judgment, just 2 people living in close quarters under pressure, and passing them felt more real than passing the other kind because nobody was watching. August ended. September came. 1 year. She noticed the date she'd arrived with a bag and a letter and walked past Hank Briggs in the morning light, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. She didn't say anything to Nathan about it. It didn't require marking. But she stood for a moment in the kitchen where she'd first heard Caleb crying, and she thought about the woman who'd walked in through that door a year ago, and what she'd known then, and what she knew now, and how those were not the same inventory. She'd known how to work. She'd known how to stay when leaving was easier. She'd known, in the way of someone who'd had it proved to her enough times, that she was capable and competent and sufficient for most things the world threw at her. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't have told you in September of last year, was what it felt like to be known by the specific people in the specific place you were in. not recognized in the general way of someone assessing a stranger and finding them adequate, but known. The way Calhoun had known her after the foal, the way Dolan knew her now, the way Birch had said to someone that this was the best run outfit he'd worked on, the way Nathan reached for her hand in the evenings without planning to, the way Caleb turned his face into her shoulder when the world was too much. That was what she hadn't known. That was what she had now. She thought, belonging is not something that happens to you. It's something that you build, and it costs you, and it takes longer than you want. And the people who say it should come naturally and effortlessly have either been very lucky or have not been paying attention. Belonging costs the thing it costs, which is showing up when it's hard and staying when you're tired and doing the work even when nobody's recording it, and doing it again and again and again until one day you look up and you're inside something real. She'd been mocked in this town before she'd even been known in it. She'd been reduced to a category: hired woman, nobody, placeholder, before anyone had looked at her as a person. She'd been threatened with removal from the life she was building by people who believed their claim was stronger than her presence. And she was still here, still in this kitchen, still making breakfast for a household that was hers in every sense that mattered, and in the legal sense too, which she was not above appreciating. Caleb came into the kitchen at speed, his current default, and grabbed her skirt and said, "Ma," with total conviction, which he said with the same conviction to Nathan and to Birch and to the dog that had shown up in August and been allowed to stay, but which he said to her most often and with the most certainty. And she picked him up and he put both hands on her face the way he always had, that direct tactile grip, looking at her with eyes that were entirely his own and somehow also Margaret's and entirely Caleb's at the same time. "What?" she said. He said something decisive and unintelligible. "That's fair," she said. "I agree completely." He grabbed her nose, which he found consistently satisfying. Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at them, and at the kitchen, and at whatever expression was on her face that she wasn't aware of making. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man she'd found in a chair with his hands clenched and his son burning with fever, this man who had let her in when the easier thing was to send her away, this man who said true things simply and didn't dress them up, who had learned to sleep again and to laugh again and to hold things loosely enough to let them be good. "September," she said. He nodded. He remembered the date too, she could see. He'd probably been carrying it around all day the same way she had. "You could have left," he said. "That first day, when Briggs told you to." "I know." "Why didn't you?" She thought about the boot in the dirt near the front step, about the washing line with nothing on it, about the sound of a baby who had been crying so long the cry had almost worn itself out. "Because leaving was wrong," she said. "Not complicated, just wrong." He looked at her for a moment and then came into the kitchen and took Caleb from her arms, which Caleb accepted with the gracious ease of someone being transferred between acceptable options, and Nathan kissed her on the temple, briefly, without ceremony, the way you did something that had become a habit, and went to the counter to pour himself coffee. She stood in the kitchen she had rebuilt from neglect and thought, this is what it looks like when the right thing and the hard thing are the same thing and you do it anyway. Not heroic, not clean, just true. Outside the September sky was that deep, specific blue that the Wyoming summer saved for its last few weeks. The blue that meant something was ending and something was about to change. That meant the year was turning toward the harder season the way it always did, the way it would always do, and that the household that would face it was not the same household that had faced the last one. She went back to the stove. Caleb, from his father's arms, said something that was almost certainly not any established word, but which he offered with the gravity of a man making an important point. And Nathan said, "You're right," with equal gravity. And the kitchen held the sound of that for a moment. The particular warmth of two people taking a baby seriously, which was one of the sounds of a house that was actually working, actually alive. She had arrived with nothing, a bag and a letter, and the refusal to leave when she was told to. She looked around at what that refusal had built, and she thought, it was enough. It turned out to be exactly enough. Not because the story was over, it wasn't, The Wells would need attention again. The winter would be hard in ways they couldn't predict yet. The Hargroves would come and go, and the relationship with them would be worked and reworked for years. Nathan would have bad months when the grief found its way back in a different shape. She would have days when she was sharp where she should have been patient, when she held the wrong things and released the right ones, when the old voice from Columbus crept back in and told her she was too much for any of this. But she was here. She was known. She was staying. And the fire was going, and the coffee was ready, and outside the world was turning toward fall the way it always did. And inside this house that had been broken, and was not broken anymore, a woman who had been told she didn't belong had built the place where she did. That was not a small thing. That was the whole thing.